Before you dive in, hit that subscribe button because you won't believe how far one power-hungry Karen went to take everything from me. This is the story of how grief, betrayal, greed, and one warning shot changed my life forever. When I buried my father, the last thing I expected was that grief would open the door to the nastiest fight of my life. A fight not with family or fate but with the most conniving woman I'd ever met, the so-called president of our HOA, who everyone knew as Karen, though I swear her name might as well have been Mephistopheles in heels. And while I tried to honor my father's last wishes on our family ranch, land worth $2.3 million that had been in our bloodline for generations, she was busy behind the scenes filing paperwork, whispering rumors, and orchestrating what she thought would be the cleanest theft of property she had ever pulled off, an HOA-sanctioned auction that I knew nothing about until the morning after the funeral, when the weight of loss still pressed on me like a stone, and I came home from the cemetery to find strangers wandering my land, pointing at the stables, measuring the barn, and speaking in low voices about square footage. And I asked one man what he was doing, and he said with a smirk that the property was scheduled for bidding next week, courtesy of the HOA, and that he was just scouting. And my heart went from mourning to rage in a matter of seconds, because my father had warned me about Karen and her hunger for control, how she always tried to push her nose into our affairs, complaining about our horses, the fencing, even the way the ranch lights shone at night, how she used the wall like her personal army to fine, intimidate, and bully. And yet I never thought she'd have the audacity to try to steal the very land we owned outright. But grief makes you blind, and while I stood at my father's grave, she filed claims that I was delinquent on HOA fees. Outrageous fees my father had always disputed and sometimes ignored, knowing they were manufactured penalties for nonsense like overgrown wild grass, on acreage that literally spanned hundreds of acres. And somehow, while I cried over a coffin, she convinced enough board members that the ranch should be seized and liquidated to cover outstanding community obligations, a phrase that still makes me sick. But I didn't know any of this until I stormed over to her pristine, plastic-looking house that same afternoon, where the roses were trimmed too perfectly, like even the flowers were scared of her. And when she opened the door with that smug little tilt of her chin, she said, "You should really check your mail more often," like this was just business, like she hadn't desecrated my father's memory with her scheming. And I lost it. I demanded she show me proof, demanded to know under what law she thought she could auction private property, and she smirked again, told me to bring it up at the board meeting, a meeting I hadn't even been informed of, scheduled for the very next day. And I realized then she was counting on my grief, on my distraction, to bulldoze this through before I could fight back. But she underestimated just how much of my father's stubborn blood runs through my veins. So I showed up to that meeting, documents in hand, title deeds, bank statements, proof that our taxes were current, everything neat and orderly. And I sat at the back until she tried to motion the vote forward, announcing the auction like it was already decided. But when I stood, the room went silent, because people rarely challenged her. And I laid down the papers one by one, calling her a liar in front of her little army. And for the first time, I saw a crack in her perfect mask, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth. But she recovered fast, claimed the documents were irrelevant, claimed the fines had snowballed beyond repair, and I swear her eyes gleamed like a predator's. And then she pulled out a different stack of papers, legal notices stamped with county marks that looked official, too official, like she had already greased the wheels of some bureaucrat. And for a second my stomach dropped, thinking maybe she really could twist the system to her will. But my father hadn't raised me to roll over. He raised me to dig, to question. And so I did. And I found out later those documents weren't what she pretended. They were half-forged, half-misinterpreted junk she pieced together to look legitimate. But in that moment, I didn't know. All I knew was that every word she spoke was trying to separate me from the only home I had left. And I left that meeting shaking, torn between despair and fury. And that's when I remembered my father's old safe in the study, the one he told me to open only when the wolves came to the door. Words I thought were just his rancher's way of speaking about hard times. But when I unlocked it, I found files, recordings, and journals. Years of him tracking every shady move Karen had pulled, from inflated HOA contracts to backroom deals with developers who wanted to carve up land for high-end subdivisions. And suddenly the puzzle fit together. She didn't just want control, she wanted the ranch because it was the crown jewel, The last open stretch of land in a county otherwise dotted with McMansions, and she had promised it to her developer friends if she could push us out. And with that knowledge, my grief hardened into purpose. I compiled everything, even went to an attorney, who at first looked skeptical until he flipped through the files and whistled low, saying, "Son, she's cooked if this goes to court." But we both knew the danger, that if she suspected I had proof, she'd double down, and I wasn't wrong, because the very next night, I caught someone creeping near the stables, clipboard in hand, snapping photos, and when I confronted him, he bolted, and I found out later he was an assessor tied to her developer friends, meaning the deal was already being sketched, like they thought my loss made me weak enough to steamroll, but they forgot one thing. This was my father's land, and blood doesn't surrender, so I stayed vigilant, double-checked locks, even carried my father's old rifle when I walked the property, not to harm, but to remind myself that this was worth protecting. And then came the breaking point. 2 days before the so-called auction, I woke to find men unloading stakes, marking boundaries, as if ownership had already changed, and that's when the rage inside me boiled over. I fired a single warning shot into the sky, the sound echoing across the fields, and everyone froze, tools clattering to the ground, eyes wide, because they realized I wasn't some pushover grieving boy. I was a man defending what was his, and though Karen later tried to spin it as threatening behavior, the sheriff, a longtime family friend, reminded her that trespassing on private land without notice was far more questionable than a rancher firing into open air, and that rattled her enough that she called for an emergency board meeting. But this time, I came prepared, with my lawyer at my side and my father's files projected for all to see, exposing years of corruption. And when the board members realized they were being used as pawns in her game, the tide shifted, voices rose against her, questions flew, and for the first time in years, she lost control of the room. But Karen wasn't done. She tried one last desperate trick, claiming I had forged the files, claiming my father had mental decline, and his records weren't reliable. A cruel, low blow that made me see red. But before I could even respond, one of the older board members, a man my father once helped when his cattle got sick, stood up and said, "That man was sharper than any of us, and if he wrote it down, I'd trust it over you any day." And the applause that followed drowned out Karen's protests, and just like that, the vote swung. Not only was the auction cancelled, but an investigation into Karen's dealings was launched, one that would eventually strip her of her position, her power, and her polished reputation. But in that moment, standing there with my father's files in hand, I realized something deeper. Grief is a fire. It can burn you hollow, or it can forge you into steel, and Karen had unwittingly given me a reason to stand taller, fight harder, and honor my father not just with tears but with defiance. And though the war dragged on for months, with court hearings, depositions, and endless paperwork, in the end the ranch remained ours, the land safe, the legacy intact. And when I ride across those fields now, I sometimes imagine my father riding beside me, tipping his hat, proud that his son didn't let the wolves devour what generations had built. And I whisper into the wind, "We're still here, Dad, because we are stronger than ever, and no Karen, no HOA, no greedy developer can ever change that."